When we hear the name Boleyn, we naturally jump to the world of the Tudors and one of the most famous women in British history, Anne Boleyn. But Anne and her family didn't just pop out of the ground. There were, of course, many generations of Boleyns before her. So who were they? Well, today I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Claire Martin onto the podcast for a discussion on this very subject. Claire's book, Heirs of Ambition, The Making of the Boleyns, is the basis for this conversation, covering how the Boleyn family started out, what led to their involvement in the Wars of the Roses, and how Anne Boleyn's great-grandfather, Geoffrey Boleyn, became one of the most important men in all of London during his lifetime. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest Podcast, episode 77, Heirs of Ambition, The Making of the Boleyns, with Dr. Claire Martin. Welcome to the Tudor Chest Podcast, Claire Martin. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you.
Good. So we're here today to talk... Well, I'm really excited about this conversation because it's about the Boleyn family before Anne Boleyn, ultimately. The basis of the conversation is your book, Heirs of Ambition, The Making of the Boleyns. Before we get into that, just a few questions to get to know you a bit better. So could you provide me with a short introduction into your background, where you grew up and so on?
Yeah, I'm from Cornwall. All of my family are Cornish and they're all in Cornwall. I'm the only one who's left the county. I went to school in Cornwall, went to university in Oxford, and then drifted away from history for a bit and did all sorts of various other jobs. And then I ended up as a tour guide at Blenheim Palace, back in the day when stately homes had actual people to take you around instead of those terrible recorded devices.
Oh, the walkie-talkie thingies, yeah.
Yes, and that reignited my love of history. So I went back to studying a bit later, did an MA at Royal Holloway, and a PhD specialising in medieval London. It was about transportation within the medieval city. So really, I'm a medievalist specialising in the 15th century.
Nice. So were the Tudors not really your entry point? You were
No, not at all.
Okay.
I'm coming around to the Tudors. The Boleyns have kind of pulled me more in that direction. So, But no, I was interested in the Boleyns because of that backstory, which takes us back into the medieval period and particularly into London.
The reason I ask is it's obvious, as you know, a lot of people find the Tudors are their gateway drug, aren't they? They're the sort of the entry into history. And then you go one of two ways. You either go backwards towards the Plantagenets, the Middle Ages, or you go into the Stuarts. But you're somewhat against the grain then. You started in the mid period instead.
Yes, I'm a bit the other way round. And the Boleyns have been my gateway drug towards the Tudors.
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, I'm now very quickly becoming just as fascinated, if not a little bit more fascinated, with the Plantagenets, because they are less, although they're so huge, we know less about them in many ways. So, and there's so much to discover still, you know? I feel like I'm quite Tudor saturated.
Yes, there is a lot of saturation within the world of Tudor history, and a lot more to discover in the medieval period. But I would have to say, as somebody who's worked on the medieval period a lot, it's quite nice to be more with the Tudors and all those extra records that don't exist for the medieval period.
Yeah. Yes.
More things written in English, albeit in terrible handwriting.
Yeah, very much. I mean, when I was, my paleography skills are not where I'd like them to be just yet, but I'm getting there slowly but surely. So was it did you always love history, or was it sort of when you went to work at Blenheim Palace, did that spark it, or were you interested in history from being a child?
No, I did history as an undergraduate degree, and I was always interested in history as a child. And I was lucky enough to have the sort of parents who are quite happily take us around to stately homes and cathedrals and allow me to spend ages trying to work out who all those kings and queens buried in that cathedral were. So, yeah, I was very... And I had a great history teacher at school.
That always helps, definitely. So if you could pick a single moment from history to go back and witness, you could jump in a time travel machine. Do you have one?
The answer to that is actually not within my period, and it's been the same since I was at school. I have terrible FOMO of the Great Exhibition, and I
Oh,
really want to go
okay.
back and go to the Great Exhibition, and particularly to see that incredible glass
Glass
building,
structure,
which
yeah.
sadly no longer exists. I mean, within my period, I would obviously go back and keep a very close eye on the princes in the tower.
Yes, that would be a good one. But am I right in thinking that the glass structure from the Great Exhibition, is that what then became Crystal Palace?
Yes, but not the Crystal Palace that is there today.
No, no, but it
It's
moved
the
to
same
Crystal.
site. They moved it, but then it burnt down.
Yeah, okay. So is there a maybe just general misconception about history that you would love to change, or do you have a specific Tudor one?
I have a very specific and very tiny Boleyn one,
Okay.
which is that Anne Boleyn's great grandfather, who was called Geoffrey, and who we will, I'm sure, be talking about,
Mm,
is always referred to as Sir Geoffrey Boleyn, and he was never knighted. And it still appears in like very up-to-date books, but there is absolutely no evidence that he was ever knighted. It wasn't common to knight mayors of London in that period. And the first time he's referred to as Sir Geoffrey is about 100 years after he died. So
right.
definitely no Sir Geoffrey Boleyn.
Got it. So would he have been referred to as Mayor Boleyn? I don't think that's the thing, is it really?
Not as a title,
Yeah.
Geoffrey Boleyn the mayor, but and then only while he was mayor. But I think part of the confusion is that it was quite common in the 15th century for the wives of men who had been mayor to take the courtesy title as of lady.
Right. That would
So
explain
his
it.
widow is referred to as Lady Boleyn, which I think is where a lot of the confusion has come from.
That's logical. That does make sense for sure.
Yeah, she would have been Lady Mayoress, and she carried on calling herself Lady.
Well, why not?
She was the daughter of a lord as well, so
Okay.
she had double reason.
So, as I said a moment, well, earlier on, the basis of the conversation is your book, Heirs of Ambition: The Making of the Boleyns. So, to start with what I hope isn't too much of an obvious question, why this book? Was there a specific moment that you decided, okay, I want to tell the story of the Boleyns before the Boleyns became the Boleyns?
Yeah. Well, the exciting and fascinating thing for me was that this incredibly famous family that we all know from the Tudor period was really created by a London merchant. So that fitted right into the world I already knew and was already familiar with. And because of that, I was aware that medieval London actually has really good surviving records. And what you normally get in a book about Anne Boleyn is a few pages in the front saying, oh, well, there was this person, he made a lot of money, Geoffrey Boleyn, he went to London, and let's get on with the more interesting Tudor people.
Yeah.
But London has great records, and I knew we could make all of those earlier generations into real rounded people rather than just a quick prelude before we get on with other things.
You start by, I mean, Geoffrey will form a large part of this conversation, but you start by briefly introducing Geoffrey by introducing the very end of his life, so his death. So is Geoffrey the man that ultimately put the Boleyns on the map, as it were?
Yes, is the short answer. He really is the most important generation of the family in the story of how the Boleyns got to where they were. So Geoffrey Boleyn was Anne Boleyn's great-grandfather. And he was born into a family from a small village called Saul, which is just north of Norwich. And the Boleyns were beginning to prosper before Geoffrey's generation, but it was Geoffrey who really got the success in London that got them out of the slow lane and on the road to wealth and power. He was one of two sons. He had an elder brother called Thomas who went to Cambridge and into the church. And then Geoffrey went off up to London, where his father had arranged for him an apprenticeship with a hatter named Adam Book, who would become a good friend and mentor, his master who trained him and clearly trained him well in how to be really successful in business. And in short, he made a huge amount of money in a very short space of time.
Yes, and this is an era when having a lot of money is your way of betterment, isn't it? You know, then you're in a position to build a bigger house. It just changes everything completely, I suppose, as it does today.
Yeah, to shape a different sort of life for the generations that come after him.
So you jump briefly back to the sort of the early 1300s, so 200 years before Anne Boleyn takes the court of Henry VIII by storm, to tell the story of Nicholas Boleyn. So what happened to him?
So Nicholas Boleyn is then 4 generations before Geoffrey Boleyn, and he's the very first member of the family that we really know much about. And a lot of that is because in 1318, he was to be found in the jail beneath Norwich Castle. And he had ended up there because he'd been arrested on appeal, which meant somebody else had been caught in a crime and had admitted that they were guilty, and they had named him as an accomplice in an attempt to save their own skin.
They were a grass, basically.
I know. But that person was named Benedict Boleyn. So he was a relative, although we don't know exactly what that relationship was.
Yeah.
And the crime was allegedly stealing 40 shillings worth of cloth from a man in Lincoln. And that 40 shillings is important because it made it a capital felony.
Right.
Fortunately for Nicholas, juries rarely convicted people accused on appeal because they knew it was often a self-serving accusation. Nicholas provided witnesses to his good character, and there were terrible problems providing a jury from Lincoln, which is where the crime had taken place, when he'd been arrested and was in Norwich. So that all worked to his advantage, and in the end, he was just released. He went home to Saul, and then we see him again a few years later, where he's again in trouble, but this time for the rather less life-threatening crime of straying sheep causing damage to some of his neighbour's property. So he is restrained to the tune of 12 sheep, which means they were taken to ensure that he put the damage right. But this is very useful because the very fact that he owned at least 12 sheep, and presumably that wasn't his entire herd, would mean that he was at least in the middle of village society and possibly a bit higher. So that's that first indication of kind of where the Boleyns are.
I just love moments like that, though, because it makes you realise, one, how funny history. I mean, we're talking about, so over 600 years ago, 700 years ago, some sheep got out, caused damage to someone's house, and that person then complained. You know, it sounds like something you'd see in a comedy sketch nowadays, not something 700 years ago, you know?
Well, that's very much what manorial court rolls are full of.
Yeah.
People committing little infringements like that and getting into trouble.
So how do you go about finding these stories? Because, I mean, if Nicholas has these sheep, then to your point, this is obviously a man that's got a certain amount of means, but he's by no means a member of the nobility. So I'm surprised that details such as that of quite ordinary people exist still.
Well, that's a great question. And this is one of the reasons that I get excited about history. Sure, it's great to talk about the more prominent and famous people who do have a lot more documentation about them. And yes, all that documentation means that you can often say more about their actual character and personality. But I love the puzzle of reading between the gaps and trying to find out what you can say about somebody's life from just 12 sheep. So all of the information for these earlier generations of the Boleyns comes from the manor court rolls for the village of Saul. Saul was a tiny village, but divided up into either the whole or part of 6 different manors. So it was very fragmented. Thankfully, for me, the biggest manor, called Kirkhall, the manor court rolls survived for almost the whole of the 14th century. The adjoining manor of Stinton, they were burnt in the Peasants' Revolt. And if that had happened to Kirkhall, we would know almost nothing about where the Boleyns came from.
I see. Okay. So is Nicholas Boleyn's story the first instance that we see a clear link between the Boleyns and the county of Norfolk?
Almost. There is a generation before Nicholas, a man called John Boleyn, but all we know about him is that he rented a house in Saul from Walsingham Abbey sometime before 1283. But Nicholas is the first we can say anything about. But the fact that Boleyns came from Norfolk is actually no surprise, because Norfolk in this period was extremely prosperous, economically powerful, and very heavily populated, not a rural backwater. And the Boleyns were from the area of the county that was involved in cloth production, early on making linen and later woolen worsted cloth. Saul had a specialism in making head coverings. So when the county was producing linen, they made linen kerchiefs. And then when the linen industry died away, they moved on to making woolen hats, which is how Geoffrey ended up being apprenticed to a hatter. But all of this means that Norfolk was actually producing quite a lot of self-starters and go-getting, socially climbing families. So as well as the Boleyns, there are other famous families like the Pastons and the Haydens, who also came from Norfolk and who were also making their way up in society.
Yeah, I was going to ask you actually about the the Paston family. But was there some crossover between them and the Boleyns?
Yes, there are letters. The Pastons are known for a large survival of a big collection of letters from the 15th
Mm.
century. And there's
Yeah,
one
they're on display. A lot of them are on display at the moment at the Medieval Women
at the
exhibition.
Medieval Women exhibition. Yes, not
Yeah.
Geoffrey's, but there is one in that collection from Geoffrey Boleyn to John Paston, and they're referred to in the letters. There's possibly a marriage connection earlier on, but that's a bit speculative. But they certainly would have known each other very well.
So, talk to me about the name Boleyn itself. We know Boleyn is spelt many different ways. Bullen, Boleyn, Boleyn. That's ultimately down to the lack of standardised spelling at the time. But do we know where the name originated from? And moreover, can we surmise a true pronunciation as Geoffrey would have pronounced it?
So we don't know for sure where the name comes from. There have been several suggestions. The most common is probably that the family came from Boleyn, perhaps at the time of the Norman conquest. However, I feel that's a bit outdated, and I think it comes from earlier authors who were looking for the Boleyns to have a more exalted origin to explain how they were able to rise up and get to where they did. But in the last 50 years or so, there's been so much more research about families using London or the church or the law and how they were able to move up through society. So I don't think we really need that explanation anymore. The fact that Geoffrey went to London and made money is enough explanation in itself. The other possible origin of the name comes from the word bole in Middle English, Bole, which is where we get the word bowl from, and it referred to round-shaped spherical items. So one possible suggestion has been put forward that an early member of the family was a bit chubby or round in shape. However, I think it's interesting that bowl could also refer to the seed pods of flax, which are round spherical seeds. So I think it might not be a coincidence that the Boleyns came from this area where linen was produced and people would have been working with flax and familiar with how the seeds were. So I wonder whether it had something to do with flax working. As far as the pronunciation is, the Boleyns tell us how it was pronounced because Geoffrey picked bull's heads for his arms, which is a pun known as canting arms, and it only really works if the name was pronounced Bullin rather than Boleyn.
Okay, so Boleyn.
Bull as in bull.
And then inn as in like INN, like you would visit an inn.
Well, that's a bit.
So Boleyn or yeah.
Why inn was added? Well, we get back to the origins of the name. If it's whether it means a round person or was referred to flax seeds, why it's in on the end is a bit unclear. The arms are not. They don't. Sometimes canting arms do the whole name. So there's a bishop of Norwich called Leichhardt, so he has a heart lying down. But they obviously couldn't make that work. Bull in what? A bull in a pot. So it's just bull heads in the arms.
That makes sense. I mean, it's one of those things, and unless we were able to quite literally go back in a time travel machine and say, right, how did you? Plus, I also suspect the way it was pronounced in the 1300s will have been different by the time it's pronounced with the Tudors. You know, there's always going to be a slight shift, and because of the lack of standardised spelling as well. So to get back to Geoffrey Boleyn, he's ultimately the central figure of your book. By the middle of the 1450s, he's now a man of considerable means. It enables him to build the famous Hever Castle. So how did he become so wealthy?
So through trade. But Adam Book, his master, was crucially not just a man who made hats. He was a successful international merchant, so trading, importing and exporting. John Stowe tells us he was so wealthy he could pay for glazing most of the windows in his parish church of St Mary le Bow. So he trained Geoffrey in how to run a business. So Geoffrey starts out as a young man in 1431, doing what most London merchants did, travelling across the North Sea to the Low Countries and the annual markets at Antwerp and Bergen. And he had £40 to spend, which is how it was the average merchant's starting capital. And he bought linen cloth, white thread, laces, more hats, and 5,600 wooden combs. So not glamorous, expensive luxuries or things you would think, oh, this man's, on to big things, but just ordinary, everyday things that he knew people would buy back at home.
You need those things after all, so,
They're all things that break or wear out and you constantly need to replace. So exporting woolen cloth and importing these sort of goods was the foundation of his business and the foundation of lots of merchants' business. He did move on from that. In his middle age, he was more of a middleman and didn't import and export so much. He bought things like dyestuffs, woad and madder, and huge quantities of ginger and pepper from Italian importers. And he also brought wool from the Cotswolds down to London, but he didn't export it himself very often. He was selling it to other merchants. So other people were importing and exporting, and he was in the middle, taking a bit of profit from their business. And he made a huge amount of money that way and left the Guild of the Hatters and went off to London's top guild, the hugely wealthy and powerful Guild of the Mercers.
I see. Okay. So he makes all this money, and one of the things he does is to build Hever Castle, which obviously is now so synonymous with the Boleyn name. But how much of Hever Castle as we see it today would Geoffrey recognise? How much of what is there was he directly involved in?
Well, he bought Hever Castle, rather than build it, but he did make various modifications while he was there. There have been quite a few changes to what you see today, particularly the entrance hall and where the staircase is.
Yeah.
And some of the internal furnishings he definitely wouldn't recognise.
Yeah, the Astor stuff.
But certainly from the outside, he would recognise the Hever that he knew. And the Great Hall in particular would probably be familiar as the room he helped to create. Because when the Boleyns bought Hever and they walked in to have a look at their new acquisition, they found a defensible manor house with most of the windows looking into the courtyard, so quite dark. So Geoffrey went about doing, as we often do, if we buy a house, we go about remodelling it to make it to our own taste. So he added windows, and he divided the Great Hall to make a smaller parlour, and living more privately in a smaller private parlour was becoming more fashionable. But particularly, they would have found a central fireplace in the Great Hall at Hever with a smoke hole in the roof. And the Boleyns had come from London, where there were very strict rules on having stone chimneys because of the risk of fire in the city. So they must have thought this seemed incredibly outdated and old-fashioned. So Geoffrey puts in a big fireplace and a chimney, although sadly the fireplace is no longer there.
I mean, what I love about Hever Castle as well, though, is actually that it's quite dinky. It's this quite little castle, but it's so beautiful and packed and full with the most amazing. I mean, it's got one of the most amazing portrait collections, I think, outside of the National Portrait Gallery.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah. So, as much as Anne Boleyn is obviously the most famous Boleyn, she wasn't actually the first Anne Boleyn. That honour goes to Geoffrey's wife. So tell me a bit about her.
So Geoffrey's wife was born Anne Hu, the daughter of Thomas Hu, Lord Hu and Hastings. And from then, the name Anne is passed down through each generation of the family. So Anne and Geoffrey had 5 surviving children: Anne, another Anne, Alice, Isabel, William, and their eldest son, Thomas, who was born in 1446. So I think it's likely they married the previous year, 1445, because Anne's father on that summer seems to have been on a mission to sort his family out. So he spent a lot of his career in France, but that summer he comes back to England. He has one grown-up daughter, he's a widower, and he doesn't have an heir. So he arranges a new marriage for himself. He decides that the property that was allocated to be inherited by Anne would now not be inherited by her, but would be settled on any offspring from his new marriage. So he's got a new wife about to come into the house, and it's time to get the grown-up daughter out of the way. Anne was about 20, so more than old enough to be married. When Geoffrey died, all of his children were underage and unmarried. So it fell to Anne at that point to steer the family forward. And she seems to have been very capable at doing that. She kept the household in London on for several years. And even 10 years after his death, she and 2 of her sons-in-law were owed £600 by John Arundel of Cornwall for merchandise he had purchased from her in London. So she continued running some of Geoffrey's business affairs. But one of the things I love about her
So
is
she
she
was.
is also an affectionate mother who, unlike many other medieval mothers, didn't see the question of her daughters' marriages as just an extension of her business affairs. And we know this because in 1467, John Paston, so the Pastons again, thought that
Mhm.
Geoffrey and Anne's daughter Alice might make him a good wife. But Anne wasn't very keen on him because he was the younger brother and he didn't have any inheritance. So she is reported as saying she
Right.
would never advise her daughter to marry him, but if the couple were in love, if they wanted to marry, she wouldn't prevent it. So, in other words, she was prepared to put her daughter's happiness first.
Oh, that is not. That's rare, actually.
It's in stark contrast to the Pastons, the way they treated their daughters, as Elizabeth Paston was beaten black and blue to try and force her into a marriage she didn't want.
Well, that is nice to know, and it's nice to know that again there was these that Anne Boleyn's great grandmother Anne Boleyn. And who, we tend to think of Anne Boleyn, the later Anne Boleyn, as this woman breaking the mold, very ahead of her time. But actually, it would seem like maybe this is a Boleyn trait that women had, that they were very strong and capable.
Yes, it does seem to go down the generations, from what we know.
Yeah.
So, and they were a very close-knit family in contrast to others, which I think helped them to get on. It helps you to get on in life if you're all working together rather than pulling in different directions.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that you see that over, with Edward the Third, for example. This was that was a reign where there were loads and loads of children, but they treated it like a family business, and therefore they pretty much all got along. And if you could do that, it was always going to be much better for everyone. So,
Yeah,
you
yes.
know, so we should also. It would be remiss of us to not discuss Blickling Hall. So Blickling is obviously a very grand property in Norfolk, although the one we see now is not the original building. So how did Blickling become part of the Boleyn story?
So yes, Hever is much more famous today as being the Boleyn's home, but it was Blickling Hall that Geoffrey bought first, and which was far more important to him, and which was the family's principal home. And he bought it from John Fastolf in 1451 and later complained about how much it cost him. But he really wanted the house in that particular location because it is very close to Saul, and he clearly really wanted to go back to near the place of his birth, but to now reappear amongst people who would have known him as a boy as a newly rich, self-made lord of the manor. He was very proud of what he achieved. And that was
Hmm.
part of a bigger campaign in the later part of his life of buying up rural property so that he could establish his two sons as county gentry. So he wasn't planning that they would follow him into trade in London. So Blickling and various other manors in Norfolk that he bought were to be inherited by his eldest son, Thomas. And then Hever was bought as the second home, which, along with his London property, were going to be inherited by his younger son, William. So separate counties where they weren't competing with each other. But William's share had about an annual income about half Thomas's share.
So, I mean, it sounds kind of like, in many ways, Geoffrey Boleyn was what we might now call a middle class man who, by virtue of the money he made, his just sort of his trajectory, his plan was for his sons to become part of the gentry by giving them these large estates, and that would then hopefully, obviously, position them differently in court circles as well.
Yes, if you were a member of the landed gentry, and crucially, if you were getting your income from landed property without having to work in trade or without manual labour yourself, that placed you in a very different class, and it qualified you for things like being a knight of the shire in Parliament or voting. So it was absolutely essential that he turned the cash he had made in London into landed real estate if his children were going to move any further than he had done in one generation.
Yeah, up the social scale, as it
Yeah.
were. So, how much of, obviously, as we've said, the original Blickling is no longer there. The house that we see today is Jacobean, I believe. But does anything of the original survive at all?
Yes, but if the Boleyns came back in their time machine, I don't think they would really recognise the house that is there today.
Okay.
So John Leyland records Geoffrey built a large house of brick at Blickling, which there is a large house of brick today, but it's not the same house. He might be responsible for the layout of the house, in that it's possible that the original house was more the size of Hever and he built a huge second courtyard extension on the back. Or a later generation of the Boleyns did. But certainly the Boleyns are probably responsible for the layout of the house as a double courtyard house. But the house that is there today was built by Henry Hobart around 1619. But when I say built, he didn't flatten the site and start again. What he did was an extensive remodel of the Boleyns house. So there are certain features that have remnants of the Boleyns. The northwest tower, for example, is slightly smaller than the other towers and is probably part of the structure of the Boleyns house. And the existence of the long gallery is probably down to the Boleyns, although its internal appearance are the Hobarts. But then inside, there are hidden things, like the structure of the house, even though you can't see it. For example, the east gable of the medieval Great Hall is now within the right-hand wall of the entrance hallway where the staircase is, but it's hidden inside.
I see. Okay, so in a way, the sort of the bones of it are kind of there, but just you wouldn't be able to see
Yeah,
it.
that's quite often how I put it. If you read the accounts of what his builders did, it's all move this floor and move this wall and put this facade up, but somewhere inside are bits of the Boleyns house.
So Geoffrey and Anne face trouble when they become inadvertently involved in Cade's rebellion. So can you, for people who may not know what Cade's rebellion was, can you just briefly explain it and what impact did it have on them?
So yeah, Cade's revolt in 1450 came out of Kent, as so many revolts do. And was really targeted at the failures of the government of Henry VI, and particularly the recent catastrophic loss of territory in France. As they marched up from Kent, ballads were circulating amongst the rebels, and they had a list of ministers they held responsible for the problems. And one of them was Thomas Hughes, Anne's father, who was closely associated with England losing territory in France, and also closely associated with the king's hated chief minister, the Duke of Suffolk. And Thomas Hughes would later be charged with corruption. So when the rebels stormed into the city, they executed the royal treasurer, James Fiennes, Lord Say and Seal, and his son-in-law, William Cromer, and then after that went after London families with links to the government. So the alderman, Philip Malpas, had his house ransacked, and the Boleyns must have been wondering if they would be next on the list when the rebels ran out of more direct targets. Fortunately for them, Londoners had an obligation to take up arms in defence of the city when necessary. And after a day or two of this, they had had enough of this mob running around executing people. And so that is what they did. And Geoffrey, in the prime of his life then, and with more reason to fight than many, was probably amongst them. And there was a brutal battle on London Bridge itself, with the drawbridge set on fire. And Londoners forced the rebels out before the Boleyns suffered any consequences.
Okay, so basically then, so at this point we're moving closely towards the outbreak of the Wars of the Roses. So with the Wars of the Roses, were the Boleyns involved? And if so, who were they loyal to?
Well, there are several phases to that. So during Geoffrey's life in London, and he became an alderman and then mayor. So he had to wear two different hats. There's Geoffrey the man, and then there's Geoffrey the alderman. So he himself seems to very much have had a partiality for the House of York, as many London merchants did. And a number of his friends were similarly inclined.
Yeah, Londoners really took to the York family, didn't they?
Yes, particularly the sort of general population, but the governors of London had to be very cautious. That was their job.
Yeah.
So Edward IV comes to the throne eventually, and he made Geoffrey a royal grant of exemption from serving in certain offices. And the grant states that it was for the good service that Geoffrey Boleyn had done to his father, Richard, Duke of York, while he was alive. Unfortunately, it doesn't tell us what this good service was. But given what Geoffrey's life was, I think it's quite likely that that good service was financial. So he only ever makes one loan to the Lancastrian government, and I think it's quite possible that was because after that he was backing the other side. But as an alderman, London's governors, their absolute priority was to keep the city neutral, to keep it safe, for there not to be fighting and bloodshed in the streets as there had been at St Albans. So, and also as a Londoner, he was protected by city privilege in that Londoners could not be forced by the Crown to provide troops to fight outside London. So there was no obligation on him to fight. He didn't have to be part of a militia that would go and join in the battles fighting elsewhere. It would be very different for his sons. Once you go into the country gentry, you don't have that London protection. And if your overlord says, well, we need troops, the king is demanding an army, or we're loyal to this side, you have to provide men, then that's a much more difficult line to tread.
At what point did Geoffrey actually become Mayor of London? And what do we know of actually what that involved day to day? I assume that there'll be some things that are very, very similar to what the current Mayor of London does, and some things that were very, very different.
Well, you've still got the ceremonial element, which I think today I would probably say is more taken on by the Lord Mayor of London, which is the descendant of the position that Geoffrey held. And then we have a Mayor of London, who's the administrative lead today. But for Geoffrey, it would have been a combination of ceremonial and regular meetings of the Court of Aldermen and active governing of the city. So he became mayor in October 1457. And personally, it would have been a huge upheaval. The Boleyn's peaceful home on Milk Street was invaded by a huge body of staff because the mayor was expected to live like a lord for the duration of his term of office, because effectively he was a lord within the city. So all of these staff come in. The city provides accommodation for them, and some of them with wages, but quite a lot of them had to be paid out of the pocket of the mayor. He had to provide them with liveries and food and drink, like a lord would provision his retainers. So that was par for the course. That was normal, being a mayor. But in 1457, everything was not normal, because, as you say, the Wars of the Roses was underway, and it was no longer a Cold War. It was a hot war after the Battle of St Albans. And London had recently gone through a serious set of riots in the summer of 1456. So the most important thing Geoffrey had to do as mayor, which is always the most important thing that a mayor is having to do, and it's part of his oath, is to keep the city peaceful for the king. That would be difficult, because Henry VI had this marvellous idea that he could make all his magnates get on by negotiating a settlement for the bloodshed of St Albans and then staging a lovely parade through London on Lady Day, the 25th of March, which they were renaming Love Day for the occasion, which meant all of the magnates came to London with all of their armed retainers. And so by mid-February, there were 3,800 armed men camped out within the city or around about, from opposing forces who hated each other. So keeping the city peaceful was now considerably more difficult. And in response, Geoffrey raised an enormous city militia of 5,000 men, and every day rode at their head in a very carefully designed loop around the city, passing by the fronts of all the lodgings of the principal lords as a show of force to get them to keep the peace and keep a lid on it. And it had to go on for weeks.
He's literally walking around going, behave.
Yeah, look, I have all of these men behind me, more than you've got, behave yourself. And it did work.
Okay.
And we have this very odd parade of people who hated each other walking through London holding hands.
I mean, it's no wonder Henry VI. I gave a talk actually earlier today for school children, and I mean, they were only 7, so I was trying to explain Henry VI and then being deposed and Edward IV coming along, and I sort of said he was a nice man, but just useless, didn't he? You know, this was not a man who could be king, you know, but he seemed like a decent man, but hopeless at the role that he had.
I always think he's the king that you'd most actually like to be friends with, because the ones that are good at being a king in the Middle Ages are probably not really very nice people. He's too kind. He wants everybody to just be nice and get on with each other, and he could have had a lovely life as a monk. It's a terrible shame that he was born to be king. He was just born into the wrong place. And to be fair to him, he had no example in his life of how to be king.
No, exactly. He was king from 9 months old, right? I think.
Yeah, and they didn't have a protector, a regent. They governed by council, so he couldn't even look at one individual performing the role of king, even if he wasn't king. So how is he supposed to know how to do that?
Yeah. I do have I mean, I must admit, I have a real soft spot for Edward the Fourth, and it's not just Max Irons. I think I don't know, I think Edward the Fourth actually does come across as probably quite a nice guy in some respects. I could be totally wrong, but with Edward the Fourth, I've always...
Did execute his brother.
What? Yes, I know that. But what I mean, like, one of the things I think does come across of Edward the Fourth, and again, maybe with saying this with hindsight, but that he treasured his daughters just as much as he did his sons. That there doesn't seem to have been that huge disappointment that he had daughters first. But maybe that's because with hindsight, he had sons. But I don't know, he just seems like he was probably, it feels like he was quite a nice guy on the whole, aside of, having his brother drowned.
He was clearly a lot of fun.
Yeah, fun. Yeah, definitely.
He liked enjoying himself, and he did a very good job of settling the country down, at least temporarily.
Yeah. So Geoffrey dies in 1463. Him and his wife Anne, they have 5 children, so 2 boys, 3 girls. Their first son, Thomas, became directly involved in the fighting of the Wars of the Roses. And you believe that he may have actually died of injuries from a battle. So what happened here, and what leads you to think that that's what happened to him?
So, unlike Geoffrey, who stayed in London and kept out of trouble, Thomas seems to have been much more keen to go off on an adventure. And he joined the affinity of Richard, Duke of Gloucester. So before he became king. And in 1469, and in that year, Richard and the king were passing through Norfolk, recruiting men to deal with rebellion in the north. And so it was probably at that point. And then later that year, in November, he's appointed attorney to deliver certain property to Richard. And the other attorneys are all men who we know were in Richard's service. So it is likely that he was as well. So then Edward IV briefly loses his throne during the readeption, and we don't know what happened to him then. But by April 1471, Edward is back in the country, and it seems likely that Thomas Boleyn had rejoined him in London so that he would be probably serving Richard, Duke of Gloucester again, as the royal forces headed out to face the Earl of Warwick at Barnet on Easter Sunday. And that battle would be absolutely brutal, fighting in very close quarters in the fog. Because the battle was so close to London, the injured men were back through London's gates within hours, with all of the blood-soaked reality of medieval warfare, which seems to have quite shocked the citizens of London, where battles were normally far away and the injured would have been left behind to be cared for before troops ended up back in London, but they saw the full brutal reality of it. And a handsome merchant who was resident in the city wrote that those who went out with good horses and sound bodies brought home sorry nags and bandaged faces without noses and wounded bodies. God have mercy on the miserable spectacle. And I think that Thomas Boleyn must have been amongst those injured men, because he died 2 weeks later in London. His will is very brief, just 19 lines long, and it's obviously a hasty emergency affair. So he wasn't somebody who'd been ill for a long time and had had a chance to consider his affairs. He just left everything to his mother. And there's no indication before that he was in any way ill. There was plague that year, but it didn't start till later in the year. So I think this sudden death of a very young and apparently healthy man and the timing, it must have been down to injuries sustained at Barnet.
So we've actually got a man there then he's the great uncle of Queen Anne Boleyn. So it's kind of, I suppose, slightly ironic that her great uncle was fighting against the Lancastrian side, and it's via the Lancastrian side that the Tudors actually come onto the throne.
It's also a very weird coincidence. Jane Seymour had a great uncle who died at Barnet as well.
Okay.
Which is a bit of a weird coincidence. Yeah. But the Boleyn story could have really easily come to an end there if they didn't have another son. Yeah. And that happened to a lot of London families who, like the Boleyns, made money but weren't able to carry on those generations.
So, that leads beautifully on to the next question about their other son, William. And it's William that the Irish Earl of Ormond title that we hear so much about sort of first appears with the Boleyn. So what was the link here? How did that title come into the mix?
Yeah, so this comes into the Boleyn family through the marriage of William Boleyn to Margaret Butler, daughter of Thomas Butler, eventually Earl of Ormond. They were married by 1469. William was around 18 or 19. Margaret was quite a bit younger. And it was undoubtedly a match arranged by William's mother to a family she probably knew because the Ormonds were important patrons of the London Hospital of St Thomas of Acre, which is where Geoffrey's company, the Mercers, met. So she probably met them there when she was in London. But this marriage was a bit of a gamble because Margaret's father was not actually Earl of Ormond when the marriage took place, because the whole family were under attainder because they were loyal Lancastrians. And also, he had an elder brother, so even if the attainder was reversed, his elder brother would become Earl of Ormond first. But the Boleyns were in luck because Thomas Butler's elder brother died unmarried, so he then inherited the title and the property after the attainder had been reversed. And then he had no sons, he just had two daughters, Margaret and her sister Anne, and so they became their joint heirs, and the Boleyns eventually inherited really a lot of property, but also a possible claim to the earldom of Ormond.
I'd like to ask you, so obviously the title of Earl of Ormond does go on to, there's a bit of a battle for it, essentially, by the time we get to the reign of Henry VIII.
Yeah.
Between Thomas Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's father, and James Butler, or is it James Butler's father? Who do you think the title should have gone to? Who do you think had the better claim?
Oh, I don't know. All I can say is that it would never have gone, I don't think, to Thomas Boleyn if his daughter had not been in the position that she was in. I mean, first of all, it was down in the female line, and she had a sister as well. So, it wasn't really obvious that the title could be inherited down that line at all.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was going to ask you, because it is via the female line. And although there is nothing to say things can't pass through the female line, it would have been pretty unorthodox.
It would not really have been the natural way for it to go if Anne Boleyn had not been where she was.
Yeah. So what role did William Boleyn play at the courts of Richard III and then Henry VII?
So William, like his brother Thomas, associated himself with Richard when he was Duke of Gloucester. And then he, of course, took the throne as Richard III, and William was created a Knight of the Bath at his coronation. So now he's in a very good position. He's close to the king, and he's also close to John Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, who made William Boleyn his deputy as Admiral of Norfolk and Suffolk. So two very powerful patrons, and they must have been hoping that all sorts of advancement would come their way. But then, of course, their patrons both got killed at the Battle of Bosworth. So that was the end of that. And the Boleyns could have been in a rather difficult position with the change of dynasty. But I think luckily for them, William was a very capable local administrator. And at this stage, he just wasn't important enough that Henry VII felt he needed to get rid of him. It was much better to keep men like him in place because he would need them to run the country.
Yeah, and he wasn't of, there wasn't any sort of royal blood there in the way that the old White Rose families like the Poles, the De La Poles, etc., posed a much greater threat,
No, and he hadn't really stuck his head above the parapet and done something really significant in support of Richard III, which would have got him in trouble. So he sailed on quite happily into a new reign. And his role really was in Norfolk and in Kent. He was the local JP, he was sheriff in both counties, and he served on local commissions. So he was one of those men who aren't famous and, don't have powerful positions, but are absolutely necessary to make royal government function in the counties outside London. So he didn't really have a position at court. He was one of many people who would be called up to town to attend big ceremonial events, like the creation of Prince Henry as Duke of York or the reception of Catherine of Aragon, but he was in no way a courtier.
So you end your book by exploring the relationship ultimately between William Boleyn and his son Thomas. So by this point we are talking about the father of the most famous Boleyn of them all. So how much impact do you think William had over the courtier that Thomas became? Because based on what you've just said, he wasn't much of a courtier. So did he have an impact, do you think, on the way Thomas then behaved or not?
To some degree. I mean, Thomas starts out of his career as a diplomat. He's highly educated. He's good with languages. And so that makes that role, he's valuable in that role. He didn't educate himself. So that clearly comes from his father realizing the importance of education and providing the necessary tutors and the
Mm.
training that he would need. So that comes from William, even though there's no record of that particular education. But William is also careful to prepare his son for the life that he would be living, and to put opportunity in his way, so that it was Master Boleyn rather than his father who hosted the king at Blickling in 1498. And you can see other families doing that with young sons. As the older generation stays out the way and puts the young person in, giving them a chance to shine when the king is coming to visit.
Yeah, they deputise effectively for them.
Yeah, well, they don't just deputise, but they're there to get themselves known, to impress and hope that they will be then given an opportunity.
Yeah.
But there are all sorts of things that Thomas's life would have required him to be able to do as a member of the country gentry. And one of them is being able to lead men into battle. And I love the way William prepares his son for this. So William and his close friend and brother-in-law Henry Hayden do the same thing. When the king needs an army to face the Cornish rebels in 1497, William and Thomas, father and son, serve together and they fight at Blackheath. But later in the year, when there's again rebellion out of Cornwall behind Perkin Warbeck, both William Boleyn and Henry Hayden stay at home, and they send their sons, who are both in their 20s, to lead their men alone. So they've done it with their father, they've seen how it's to be done, and then just a few months later, they're sent out to do it on their own.
Do you reckon their dads were just knackered by that point?
I think they, to be honest, I think they might have been. But it works out quite handily.
Yeah.
But I think, in a way, one of the most important things William did was get Thomas married to Elizabeth Howard.
Yeah.
Thereby providing him and Anne with this sort of illustrious, noble and relations that the Boleyns couldn't provide for themselves.
So I was going to ask you just one final question, given the conversation today, which is Anne Boleyn's year of birth. Where do you land? Are you 1501? Are you 1507? Are you one of those mavericks who thinks 1504 could be a possible?
No, I would lean towards 1501.
Okay.
Yeah. Although I have some strange opinions on where.
Okay, so I'm assuming then that you don't think Blickling.
I think possibly not Blickling. I would need more evidence to say definitely not Blickling. But I do look at where William was in the last years of his life, and there is good evidence that he was very active in Norwich, in Norfolk. It's one of his most active years as JP. So I don't think, as is sometimes suggested, that he'd moved off down to Kent to Hever Castle, leaving Blickling for Thomas and Elizabeth to move in. I think he was still very much using Blickling, and also using Hever, which is what he'd done for his entire life. Blickling was work, Hever was pleasure, because the hunting is better down there. And I think he very much wanted to carry on doing that. And what I find very interesting is that Thomas Boleyn gives the Boleyns' other home at Luton Hoo in Bedfordshire as one of his residences in the 1509 pardon roll. And Luton was an awful lot closer to London than Blickling, which is a very long way away from London. So I do wonder whether they went off and used that house in the early years of his marriage, because it would have been a lot more convenient for a man starting out of court. He could get down to London really quickly. But we would need more evidence of what actually was at Luton Hoo at that period, because there's no surviving house there. The later houses completely wiped away all the medieval houses. So we know there was a good residence there, a grand residence there in the 15th century, because it was where Anne Hoo's father had lived in the early part of his life. But whether there was a house there that would be habitable by the beginning of the 16th century is really unclear.
I see, okay. I used to be Team 1501, but I'm now fully in 1507 territory.
Oh,
yes, I have become convinced by 1507, and I think one the main thing I think is that actually when you step back, well, to me, when you step back, it just feels more logical. Simply for the simple fact that Anne's age is, to the best of my knowledge and belief, never mentioned by even her worst enemies. And I feel like, Henry VIII was marrying her because he wanted sons. And if she had been born in 1501, then we're talking about a woman who's 32, about maybe turning 33 at the point she marries Henry. which is getting on by Tudor standards, certainly to having your first pregnancy, and yet her age is never ever mentioned, even by.
Well, those are the two arguments, really, aren't they? It's that, which is really convincing on its own, and then there's the letter. That, where she was a very precocious child.
Well, it could, again, the 1501 argument kind of rests on the letter, I think, more than anything.
And the later argument rests on the fact that there was no question of her being able to produce plenty of children. It's which one you pick.
Yeah, and
really, I should get in my time machine and go and ask Thomas Boleyn.
Who knows? Well, thank you so much for coming on and having a chat. This has been so interesting because we think we just know the Boleyns, but we don't. We know a portion of the Boleyn. So it's been lovely to learn more about where they came from.
I think I love them. They were just so inspiring. They worked so hard, and in some ways, I feel I've inadvertently made Anne's death and the end of the family even more tragic by emphasising all the hard work that went into getting them where they were, which then tragically all just failed and came to an end.
They weren't to know, were they? I mean, Geoffrey Boleyn probably would have been jumping for joy discovering that his great-granddaughter became queen, but then would be spinning in his grave by how it ended.
Well, but also possibly horrified at the religious changes that came along with that. Yeah.
Well, as I said, thank you again so much for coming on. So if anyone wants to follow you, are you on social media?
You can find me on Twitter at Dr. Claire A. Martin, or at my website at clairemartin.uk.
Wonderful. And what are you working on at the moment? Are you allowed to share if you're working on any new book or?
I've got I do a bit of more academic stuff and popular stuff. So I've got a book coming out later this year, which is about Sir Thomas Charlton, who was a Speaker of the House of Commons. And it's a publication of the accounts written after his death, but also a marvellous inventory, which takes you on a tour around a 15th century house, room by room. So if you're interested in how people furnish their homes, you can go from room to room and find out what their decor was like.
Oh, Sarah Morris is going to go absolutely nuts for that.
It's a very fashionable chamber that's all black and white.
Yeah. Oh, lovely. That sounds brilliant. Well, as I said, thank you again for coming on to have a conversation. I look forward to meeting you in the flesh in May because you're coming on to speak at our tour that Sarah and I are doing. And thank you again.
That's right. Thank you very much for having me. It's great fun.
And so that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess Podcast. My thanks to Claire Martin for coming onto the show to discuss the Boleyn family with me. If you would like to read her book, Heirs of Ambition, The Making of the Boleyns, then you can find it on Amazon. Trust me, it's well worth it. Thank you for listening to the Tudor Chess Podcast, and speak soon.